Welcome back. For almost a decade in the United States, the business culture of the 1920s produced an economy of booming prosperity, in which it seemed the financial good times would never end. However, like all great parties, an end must come, and when it arrived, it was beyond anyone's imagination. For the Roaring Twenties, the roar would soon be silenced by the financial crash of Wall Street in October of 1929. The crash, itself the largest since records have been kept, was soon followed by a depression. The Depression, or as it would later be known, the Great Depression, was something that the world economies had never seen and would last almost a decade itself. This is a lecture about financial catastrophe, the likes of which we hope we'll never see again, and it's also a lecture about the lessons I hope we haven't chosen to ignore, given the financial difficulties faced not only by the U.S., but global economies. This is going to be a two-part lecture series. The first where I examine the crash of '29 up until the election of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1932, and the second part will cover Roosevelt trying to come to grips with the Depression with his policies known as the First and Second New Deals, ending in 1939. So again, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, join me as I act as your escort as I take you through the thickets of U.S. history as we discuss Chapter 22, Depression, Dissent, and the New Deal. So let's talk about the coming of the Great Depression. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding about what is the Depression, what causes the Depression, and many people seem to think that with the financial situation as precarious as it was, that somehow the stock market itself crashing caused the Great Depression. This is not true. It wasn't just the crashing of the market itself that caused the Great Depression. The stock market tries to anticipate the economy. The stock market is not the economy, and we've talked about this before in class. You buy a piece of stock within a company, and it's gambling pretty much. You're gambling on the fact that the price of your stock could rise, but there's also the possibility that it could fall. So again, the stock market crashing doesn't cause the Great Depression, and we'll go into a little bit more detail in the next slide. What we're seeing is, yes, during the 1920s, it was booming prosperity. But by the time that we get to the end of the decade, what we're seeing is there is actually signs that there's trouble brewing. The first signs really appear in the California and Florida real estate markets. What we're seeing is there's great bubbles forming within these markets, and eventually the bubbles burst. What's happening? Well, California and Florida are touted as these great places to live, the seaside, great weather all year round. People are moving out there. Investors are pouring into these companies, millions of dollars. Companies that don't have the capital are going to banks, getting loans. People are employed in these industries and housing. And then all of a sudden, the market falls apart. What does that mean? People are unemployed. Businesses are closing. Banks that invested into this, right? They're closing shop too, and land is going undeveloped. What we're also seeing is there's a depression in farm goods at this time. The farmers are really kind of the first ones hard hit by kind of this economic downturn. Farmers, like businesses in other areas of the nation, are expanding too rapidly. They're buying lots of land, buying heavy machinery to cultivate the land. And what we're seeing is in Europe, they're no longer needing our farm goods. Their economies are now back on their legs. Their farmers are now growing things. So now there's no longer a need for American farm goods. This causes kind of a depression in farm goods and prices. And the farmers, like I said, are the first ones that can be touched by this economic disaster that's about to descend upon us. Also, what we're seeing is our economy is built around consumer spending. And what we're seeing is that spending is starting to slowly decline by 1926. So those goods that we had talked about in the previous chapter, washing machines, cars that you could buy on credit or payment plans, Americans now are holding on to their money. They are not spending it on these goods. Also, what we're going to see is, we kind of just talked about this, a fall in the stock market is inevitable. It's about to happen. The stock market itself has been severely bloated with thousands of people investing, and we're going to see the effects of that in just a moment. Also, what kind of helps to facilitate this is Germany defaulting on its war reparations. After the end of the First World War, we talked about this. Germany was forced to pay back to the nations that had fought against her large amounts of money. And how do you pay this out? In German gold. And what we're seeing is Germany can't afford to pay out any more money to the victors such as Britain and France. Britain and France were in turn using that money to pay back the war loans that we extended to them during the First World War. Hence the reason when we had to fight the war, we chose Britain and France because we had extended so many loans to them. So in turn now Britain and France are no longer making any payments to the United States. Throughout the 20s in the stock market, investors had really expected healthy stock profits. It was seen as kind of getting rich quick, as it kind of still is today. And what we saw was, by 1928, the highest prices surge on the stock market. So much so, from 1925 to 29, stocks are doubling. You're making money hand over fist. And it goes from $34 billion to $64 billion. Now that's 1920s dollars. If you want to figure out what that means in our time, times it by 10. So quite a lot of money is flowing through these stock markets. What we see is by 1929, it appears as the sky is still the limit. There's no real signs that anything is going to happen within the stock market, and prices continue to decline. What we see, however, by September is the prices in stocks start to plateau. They're not going any higher, and a lot of economists are predicting this is just a small kind of blip in the road, and eventually the stock prices again will take off. However, by the time that we get to October the 23rd, a wave of selling starts to happen within the stock market. People are panicking. They don't believe that the prices are going to continue, and so now they're offloading all that stock they bought onto the market. What does that do? Well, that means that the price of their stock is now starting to plummet. So when we get to October the 24th, selling prices start to spin, so much so that 13 million shares have now been dumped onto the market. And like we said, the more shares that are dumped onto the market, it lowers the price. By October the 24th, 16 million shares hit the market, and this is pretty much a signal that the stock market has crashed and the boom is now over. Again, where did this really come from? It was the fall of this bloated market. Everyone was investing in this. Thousands of people were putting their life savings into these stocks. People who couldn't afford to buy stocks were actually going to banks to actually get loans to get the money to buy the stocks. And you can see what a great mess this was. And this was also, like I said, due to this wild speculation of the 20s. Also, it didn't help that you were having stockbrokers promising customers terrific returns on stocks that they knew that were pretty much worthless. Even the president of the New York Stock Exchange himself, Richard Whitney, went to jail after all of this, after it was found he was pretty much ripping off his customers, and he pulls his stocks out and sells early. So what is the effects of those who actually lost their money on Wall Street? Well, you can imagine what it would be like being a millionaire one day and being dirt poor the next. A lot of people couldn't handle it, and many committed suicide. What we're going to see is this is just kind of the beginning of suicides in America this time. By the time we get into the Depression, it's going to be the highest rates of suicide we've ever had in our history. Many people chose just to take headers right off buildings and throw themselves off and hit the sidewalk, as you're seeing here in this picture on the left. Others left with no money whatsoever, had to pretty much sell whatever the property they had. As you can see here on the left, this is a picture of Walter Thompson. He was pretty much a millionaire the day before, and having invested so heavily in the stock market, he has nothing left, and he's willing to sell his nice looking car there for $100. He's lost it all in the stock market, so his sign says. So with the crash of the stock market, a lot of these investment companies that had promised their investors pretty much pie in the sky, they're pretty much gone the next day. Thousands of investors are wiped out, like I told you. Many people can't handle it, and they start committing suicide. Others, they're left with not a nickel in their pocket. But even though the stock market crashes, that doesn't mean it affects everyone. Only 2.5% of Americans actually own stock in the stock market. So this crash didn't affect a large majority of Americans. And this is why the crash itself doesn't cause the depression. It is one symptom in a growing sickness that's going to affect America. What we're kind of seeing is, like I told you just before, the real estate speculations boom and then the bust. That was another kind of red flag that trouble was heading down its way during the American economy. Really, the weakest link in this was the banking system itself in America. When we talked about Woodrow Wilson, one of the last progressive presidents that we have, and him setting up the Federal Reserve, that was the first time we had a central bank since Andrew Jackson destroyed the second bank of the United States. And by this time, only 1/3 of the banks of the United States were part of the Federal Reserve System. So most of our banks throughout the country are small, they don't have enough capital. And what we see is when financial times get difficult, many people start to panic and they go to pull their money out of the bank. Well, where does a bank get money to operate? From its depositors, you and me going and depositing our money into the bank. However, when people start to get afraid that bad financial times are coming, they go and immediately draw their money out of the bank. What does that do? Well, it pretty much breaks the bank because now the bank doesn't have the money to function. They can't give out loans, and that's how banks make money, right? Loaning out money, interest. But the banks are not always going to have the money on hand because as soon as you deposit it, the bank takes it and actually loans it out to people. So again, a lot of these banks don't have the capital to meet the depositors' needs. What happens? Well, as the picture shows here on the left, as you can see, many banks, to stop a run on the bank as it's known and pretty much breaking the bank, just close the doors. They won't allow their customers in. They're hoping the panic will subside. But again, Americans, they want their money, right? And they feel cheated by these banks. So what you're seeing on the right also is a picture from inside. The chaos that ensues as people are trying to get their money, their deposits back, and the bank just can't give the money to them because it's not there. So a lot of these banks, these small undercapitalized banks throughout the United States that weren't part of that Federal Reserve, end up failing and people have pretty much lost their life savings. Now the question is there one man in the United States that could be seen to have tackled this problem? People who had faith in their leaders? Yes, Herbert Hoover. He was really seen as better than most to confront this crisis. He was kind of an up from the bootstraps kind of guy, orphaned at an early age. He lived with relatives in California. After graduating from Stanford, he becomes a self-made millionaire in the mining industry. He gets into public service. He's responsible for really, after the First World War, providing a food relief program for Belgian civilians that saves them from starving. And he goes on into the Harding and Coolidge administrations, serving as Secretary of Commerce. So it looks like this guy is the man best well-suited to tackle this problem. However, what we're seeing is a lot of the old thinking about economics is still prevailing at this time. Laissez-faire and something of kind of social Darwinism. What we're seeing is economists are saying that the government shouldn't get involved in this. In the past, if you remember, we've had depressions before and panics, and the government didn't get involved. And a lot of people are telling the president, like his Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Millen, who is also the third richest man in America, is saying that the government should stay out. Downturns are kind of the natural process of the economy, of capitalism. For every up, there will be a down. And if you remember, we were talking about that, right? We used the metaphor of the roller coaster. For every up, there is a down. And if somehow government sticks its hand in, it could even make the situation worse. So again, government couldn't help spur the economy. It had to do it on its own. There's also that thinking, too, that if the government supplies funds to Americans, somehow it's going to ruin their character. So again, it's that old or earlier thinking from the 19th century, still influencing economists at that time, that somehow will ruin the character of Americans. If they're given aid, they're not going to go out and actually try to pull themselves up from their bootstraps, get jobs, and take care of themselves, and that they're going to rely constantly on the government to give them a handout. So it'd be, you know, if we're kind of comparing it to today's situation with the stimulus money that should be coming out during this kind of time of financial crisis ourselves, these economists, Herbert Hoover, wouldn't have approved of things like this, right? Again, it wasn't government's business to interfere in the economy. So again, what a lot of these people at the time don't understand is our economy is built around consumer spending, like it is today. And if they didn't somehow try to jumpstart it, the economy itself was going to slowly ground to a halt. So if Hoover is not committing to giving government funds out to individuals or getting involved whatsoever in the economy, what is he really kind of committed to? Hoover is committed to something called associational or volunteer action. And what he's relying upon are businesses themselves to keep investment up, keep employment up, and that somehow charity is going to be provided by local charities, civic groups, church organizations, cities themselves. Again, it's not the responsibility of the federal government to provide for its citizens. And so by taking these actions, a lot of people see that Herbert Hoover is really out of touch with reality, that he's in some kind of dreamland that no longer really exists. And it's not that Herbert Hoover was a cruel man. It was, again, that his belief in those old economic ideas, he sticks to them for quite a while. So faced with this depression, what is Herbert Hoover trying to do? Well, what we're seeing is Hoover approves of something called the Smoot-Hawley Tariff, which really makes the situation worse. In trying to protect the American farmer from Americans buying other European goods, have Americans buy American goods, he enacts the Smoot-Hawley Tariff. And what this does is this actually increases the tariff on goods, farm supplies, from other nations that are coming in. How do other nations respond to it? Well, it's almost like a tariff war, right? Once we enact tariffs against other nations, they in turn will enact tariffs on us. So again, goods are not flowing across the oceans, right? And with this, the result is, a reduction in international trade. Also, Hoover has this kind of bright idea, and I'm not sure where this really came from, to balance the budget of America at this time. The question is, how do you balance a budget? Well, you actually increase tax spending. And so what we're doing is we're taking more dollars out of citizens' pockets at a time when they should have kept it, and they were able to go out and buy things to keep the economy going. So what we see is we're reducing Americans' ability to purchase, and thereby we're weakening the economy in turn. One of the things that Hoover actually comes across and finally supports is something called the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, the RFC. Now, what exactly is this? Hoover himself, as we said before, didn't support the idea of government going out and handing money to citizens, but he was open to the idea of government giving funds to big businesses, places like banks, railroads, other big industry. Now, you're asking, well, why not give it to individual citizens? And there's the kind of catch-22. Which one really supports the economy? By me giving the money to these businesses, I'm able to keep these businesses open, people employed, and we're producing things. But on the other side, it could also be argued by giving citizens the money, they're actually able to go out, buy things, and actually keep the economy going. So by this time, nothing really seems to be working for Hoover, and his critics who are complaining that he's not doing enough or he's doing too much, nobody's really offering any kind of alternatives for Hoover. So I think when we get into this depression with Hoover, I think it really traumatizes him to the point that he just kind of eventually shuts himself off, and he doesn't want to hear any more about this. He's tried what he could, and he's kind of holed up in the White House, just kind of mad at the world. So, with this, like I said, America is transformed. We talk about, I could say, a depression in economic terms, but there's the term for depression in psychological terms. And we're going to see how this depression is affecting millions of Americans. So let's talk about Hoovervilles and dust storms. What we're seeing is America's life is pretty much transformed. Before, we were experiencing booming prosperity and there was faith in big business. Now hundreds of thousands of Americans are out of jobs, and they're hitting the roads, going wherever they can to find jobs into different cities. And if you remember the picture I showed you at the beginning of the slide, it said homeless or jobless man, keep going, we can't take care of our own. These guys are just kind of going wherever they can, wherever they hear rumors of jobs. There's jobs in Chicago, Detroit, Dallas, Atlanta. they're flocking out to go find these jobs. But once they get there, of course, there's no jobs. It's like chasing El Dorado. Thousands of people are left without jobs, no money. No money means they can't buy food, they can't provide for their families. So what we're seeing in many cities, thousands of people are hitting bread lines. Those local charities, either supported by the city themselves or civics groups or church organizations, they're helping to feed these people. But they're already stretched to their limits as it is. So in places like Detroit, we have 4,000 children just waiting for a piece of bread. And this is in America, which a few years earlier had been one of the most prosperous countries in the world. Thousands of people have lost their homes, and many have tried to put homes together from whatever materials they could put together, wood, cardboard, you name it. And to let loose their frustrations at President Hoover, they began calling these things Hoovervilles. A collection of these little shacks together, they became known as Hoovervilles, these shanty towns. Like I told you, there was no direct government money going to supply the cities to support these people. So again, cities have little money to rely upon, and their financial resources are kind of stretched to the limit. They can't apply to the federal government like we're seeing for federal aid with what we're doing with Corona now. So cities themselves have to flip the bill. They have hardly any money, and it gets so bad in places like Chicago, the mayor, Anton Cermak, is actually going through the phone book, calling citizens, asking, will you please pay your taxes so we can help provide for our people. Another thing is, if you remember in the last chapter, we were talking about record numbers of Americans leaving rural areas and moving into urban areas. This has now stopped, and what we're seeing now is there is a reverse to this. So much so, by 1935, 33 million Americans are now living on farms. And keep in mind what we just said about the situation in the country. It was already at breaking point, and now you have millions of Americans going out trying to grow their food. And this is the most we've ever had in rural America before or since, going out into these areas. As I said before, our suicide rates reach the highest levels that it's ever been in the United States. And hopefully they will never go to that rate ever again. But what we also see is birth rates are falling to its lowest level in the United States. Why? Because of bad economic times. People can't afford to raise children. They can't afford to care for them. So it would seem selfish to have children in these kind of desperate economic times. What you're seeing here is the picture on the left illustrates what we've been talking about, these bread lines in which thousands of jobless men are just kind of queuing up for a sandwich, some soup, if they can even get this. And this is in New York City. Again, these are private charitable organizations that are providing this. This is not the federal government. What you're seeing here on the right is a collection of these little shanty towns. It's a Hooverville outside of Washington, D.C. And as you can see, it's in the kind of poor area of the city next to the railroad tracks right there. So again, thousands of people who had lost their homes were forced to kind of put a home together for themselves or their families with whatever material they could find. Another event that kind of transpires not really at the beginning of this financial crisis, but around 33-34 is the Dust Bowl. And if you've ever heard of the movie or read the book The Grapes of Wrath, it details quite well the kind of plight of the American farmer in the Midwest with this Dust Bowl. If you remember when we talked about the settlement of the West, about the plains themselves having very little rainfall, nothing really grows up there except grass, there's no trees. When farmers would go out, they continuously plowed the fields in something called dry plowing. Once it rained, they would go out and plow the fields continuously to stop, or I should say, to kill weeds from growing up that would take really the valued water from the ground. With generations of them doing this, and then later going in the winter months and planting winter wheat, this was pretty much wearing out the top soil. So much so by 1933, that winter of 33-34, where we had kind of record cold temperatures in these areas, it killed the winter wheat. And what we saw is by the summer, there were droughts hitting the Midwest, so much so that when the wind would blow, you would have these great dust storms forming throughout the Midwest in America. What was the result of this? Well, again, towns would be enveloped in this dust, It was kind of similar, I guess, if you've ever lived out into West Texas and the dust storms kind of blow and you never can really keep your house clean because there's always grit and stuff. This is how it was, but times that by 100, and that's the effects of the Dust Bowl. What is the effect for the American farmer? Pretty much a lot of them have to pack up and move to different areas of the United States. But you can imagine what that would be like, going to areas where there's no jobs as well. And if you've read The Grapes of Wrath, it details the Joad family, I believe, leaving from Oklahoma and hopefully trying to get to California to find jobs, I think picking fruit. So again, there's great effects going on throughout the United States. So you're thinking, with all these bad times, citizens themselves are reaching the breaking point, and they're letting their frustrations off in protest. As we told you, the farmers themselves were the first area of the economy that was hardest hit, agriculture, and they themselves formed the Farm Holiday Association. And what is this, you're asking yourself? Well, what this was an organization set up by farmers to actually block roads to keep low-priced crops from actually being sent to market. Again, they're protesting the selling of these crops at such ridiculously low prices. What we see also in cities are residents are also protesting there as well. And if you remember, when we talked about the end of the First World War, things like unions and the Socialist Party had pretty much been eradicated in the United States. The Communist Party itself was pretty much eradicated. However, the Communist Party themselves are starting to kind of resurface, and they're playing a larger role, and they seem to be the ones kind of helping to organize these protests and these marches. And again, it's for their benefit, because it seems like capitalism itself has pretty much fallen apart, and Karl Marx was right. What we're seeing is there's other protests throughout the country as well. This one is not organized by the communists, but this is World War I veterans. At the end of the war, they were promised a bonus that would be paid by the federal government by 1945. However, a lot of these veterans are going to Washington to protest Congress, demanding that they get their bonuses early. They need it now. And a lot of them are holed up in buildings, the federal buildings in Washington, D.C., and camped outside of Washington in a place called Anacostia Flats. If you can see here, the picture on the right illustrates what I'm talking about. Here are all these veterans with their different signs and showing the different areas they're from throughout the country, protesting that the government should go ahead and give them their bonuses. Here's a stamp, well, my picture's probably blocking it, known as a Cinderella stamp. And what this was a stamp kind of issued by private groups or other companies. A Cinderella stamp is not something that's actually issued by the federal government. But this was issued out by different groups to show their support for the bonus marchers. What we're seeing is the World War I veterans are asked to disperse because Congress isn't going to pay their bonus. And when many refuse, the police are brought in, and later Hoover turns to the Army itself to put down the bonus army. So here it is. World War I veterans are being put down by the U.S. Army. Many of them are the friends putting down, their fellow soldiers here. And Hoover turns to Army Chief of Staff Douglas MacArthur to put this down. And MacArthur uses a contingent of infantry, cavalry, and 6 tanks commanded by George S. Patton. And he pretty much crushes the marchers. He drives them out of the buildings and takes the fight all the way to Anacostia Flats to their Hoovervilles, and he burns it down to the ground. There's Douglas MacArthur right there. Again, my picture's probably blocking it, but you can go back into the other slides and look and see. Douglas MacArthur is right there. Beside him is Major Dwight D. Eisenhower, 2 guys who will be made famous in World War II, and we'll talk about that in our next chapter. And there is the burning of the Hoovervilles of the bonus army, and as you can see in the background is the dome of the U.S. Capitol building. One guy who actually heard about the march, and when he heard about it, he was kind of happy that it happened because it guaranteed him he would probably become the next president, and that was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, being the Democratic nominee for the presidential election in 1932. If there was any guy you would have thought that would have represented the common man during this Depression, many people would have said Herbert Hoover, the self-made millionaire, up from the bootstraps kind of guy. But the irony is, the one person that actually comes to be seen by most Americans symbolizing, their ordinariness, is a guy from wealth and privilege, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Well, who is this guy, FDR? Well, he's actually the fifth cousin to Teddy Roosevelt, and when we talked about Theodore Roosevelt and Teddy Roosevelt, I think a lot of you guys have gotten mixed up with FDR, and I heard you guys kind of talking about that. But he is actually the fifth cousin to Teddy Roosevelt. However, he ends up marrying Teddy's niece, Eleanor Roosevelt. So I suppose the Roosevelts like to keep it within the family. Yeah. What we see is Roosevelt, again, comes from this background of wealth and privilege, and for him, he's only interested in running for office. So he is a natural politician. He's very inspiring. He's hands shaking, smiling. He just radiates this confidence, and many people talk about this confidence. However, he's also kind of a loner, much like Herbert Hoover, and a lot of people said, you know, I loved him, I knew him, you know, but deep down I didn't really know what made him tick. Well, for Roosevelt, it's really politics. And he becomes, in 1904, a state senator for the state of New York. Eventually, he'll become the U.S. Secretary of the Navy during World War I. And later, he'll become governor of the state of New York before he becomes a Democratic candidate for president. However, at the age of 39 in 1921, Roosevelt contracts a disease known as polio, and he pretty much loses the use of his legs. He has no hip muscles left, and he's pretty much confined to a wheelchair. However, they don't want this to be known, and we'll talk about that in just a moment in the next couple of slides, how the Roosevelt people try to cover this up. Roosevelt, like I said, in 1932 becomes the Democratic Party candidate. And with this, Roosevelt promises a new deal for the American people, though he doesn't really specify what this new deal is. And the thing about Roosevelt and how a lot of people get behind Roosevelt and believe in him is, again, that charisma. He radiates this hope that, you know, today I may not have enough to eat, or today I don't have a job, but tomorrow I will. And this was in stark contrast to Herbert Hoover, whose speeches didn't really inspire people. Hoover was telling them prosperity's just around the corner, and most people don't really believe in Herbert Hoover anymore. What we see is, by the election, Roosevelt beats Herbert Hoover by 472 electoral votes to Herbert Hoover's 59. With this, the Democrats take a landslide also in Congress. As I told you before, FDR had a very well-kept secret, I guess you could say, with his polio. As I told you before, he had no hip muscles, he was confined to a wheelchair, he couldn't move, but yet he gave the appearance of being a healthy candidate. How did he do it? Well, he was assisted by his son, Jimmy, and what Roosevelt would do is he would actually wear these 10-pound steel braces on his legs, so it supported him, and he would hold himself up by a cane, but it really wasn't walking. Oftentimes, it was just him moving his body from side to side, using all of his weight to throw on one side to the other to give the appearance of walking. And often, he would also hold onto the arm of his son, Jimmy, right there, and Jimmy would later say it felt like his father was about to break his arm off. However, like I said, this was very precarious. It wasn't a good way to move around because just a kind of a stiff breeze or someone bumping into him would have knocked Roosevelt on his back, and he couldn't have really gotten up. Also, what they did is they had a kind of special car for Roosevelt where it gave the impression that he was actually driving, but what it was is a car that was actually controlled by hand levers. He wasn't using really the brake or the accelerator with his feet. Again, he was using handles on the car, inside the car itself, to control the speed and braking the car. What they really wouldn't show you is how Roosevelt gets into the car and gets out of it. Usually what they would do is they would kind of signal to reporters that, hey, you know, turn off the cameras, and what they would do is they'd throw Roosevelt over the shoulder of his servant or later Secret Service agent. So the man was pretty much helpless to a certain extent. Here's Roosevelt here at the bottom in his wheelchair, homemade wheelchair. He really got the idea from a kitchen chair that he had in his house. And there's very few pictures showing him in the wheelchair itself. They were very self-conscious about this because they didn't believe someone who was suffering from this disease would be elected president. And amazingly enough, the press in America at the time went along with it. No one really reported this, and photos were kind of censored here and there, and they couldn't really show the president, or they wouldn't show the president in these kind of compromising situations. Here's FDR and his first vice president, John Nance Garner. And why am I showing you this? Well, John Nance Garner is from northeast Texas. He's actually just from a town outside of Paris called Detroit. And as you can see right there, there's John Nance Garner, and Roosevelt, again, giving the appearance that he's healthy and he can stand. But if you notice, he's holding on very tightly to the railing that's been conveniently provided for him. John Nance Garner himself had become very famous in saying that the office of the vice presidency wasn't worth a warm bucket of piss. All right, ladies and gentlemen, that's the end of part 1 for chapter 22. Join me again, and we'll finish talking about chapter 22 as we examine what Franklin Delano Roosevelt does to combat the Great Depression with the first and second New Deals. Until next time, ladies and gentlemen, have a good day.